In the vast tapestry of the galaxy, where species measure their worth by fangs, claws, and the ability to tear flesh from bone, humanity stands as an anomaly. We are neither the strongest nor the fastest, yet something in our nature makes even the most feared predators pause. This is the story of Dr. Sarah Chun, a xenobiologist who discovered that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to a predator is not to run, not to fight, but to simply laugh. When the Galactic Council's most elite hunters gather on the neutral station Kepler's Rest, they come to prove their supremacy. When a human arrives with nothing but research equipment and an infectious smile, they're about to learn why Earth's children play with creatures that would terrify seasoned warriors. Sometimes the greatest predators aren't those with the sharpest teeth. They're those who can turn a moment of potential violence into one of unexpected joy. What happens when a hunter becomes the hunted and the prey becomes the teacher? What happens when laughter echoes through corridors built for intimidation? The answer lies in a simple moment. A small predator cub, a torn jacket, and the sound that would change how an entire galaxy views humanity forever. Dr. Sarah Chun pressed her palm against the cool metal of the viewing port as her transport ship approached Kepler's Rest. The massive space station rotated slowly against the backdrop of stars, its angular architecture designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Built by the Korthak Empire, every surface seemed to bristle with implied threats, from the weapon-like protrusions that were actually docking arms to the blood-red lighting that pulsed along its hull like a giant heartbeat. First time seeing a predator station? Asked Captain Martinez from behind her. The grizzled transport pilot had been making runs to various galactic outposts for 20 years, but even he seemed tense as they approached. First time visiting one, yes, Sarah replied, adjusting her worn field jacket. The garment had seen her through xenobiology expeditions on 17 different worlds, and she felt naked without it. Though I've studied the architectural psychology, every design choice is meant to trigger prey responses in visiting species. Martinez snorted. Well, it's working. My gut's telling me to turn around and burn hard for home. Sarah smiled, her brown eyes crinkling at the corners. At 32, she had spent more time with alien life forms than most humans spent with their own families. Where others saw monsters, she saw fascinating evolutionary adaptations. Where others felt fear, she felt curiosity. It was this perspective that had earned her the assignment to the Galactic Council's first interspecies behavioral study. Docking request acknowledged, human vessel, came a gravelly voice over the communication system. The translator rendered it in flat, mechanical tones, but Sarah could hear the underlying rumble that spoke of a throat designed for roaring. You are cleared for Bay 17. Be advised, station security protocols are in effect. Any aggressive behavior will result in immediate ejection into space. Charming, Martinez muttered, but he guided their ship toward the designated docking bay with practiced ease. As they settled into the docking clamps with a series of metallic thuds, Sarah gathered her equipment bags. Her research gear was decidedly non-threatening. Cameras, scanners, sample containers, and her prized collection of Earth animal documentaries. She had learned long ago that showing rather than telling was the key to cross-species communication. You sure about this, Doc? Martinez asked as the airlock cycled. I could wait around for a few days, bring you back if things go sideways. I appreciate the concern, Captain, but I'll be fine. The Galactic Council has guaranteed safe passage for all research personnel. Sarah shouldered her bags and grinned. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? The airlock opened with a pneumatic hiss, and Sarah stepped into a corridor that seemed designed by nightmares. The ceiling soared 20 feet overhead, easily accommodating the largest species in the galaxy. Bioluminescent strips provided lighting that cast everything in shades of amber and crimson. The walls were decorated with what appeared to be hunting trophies from dozens of worlds, though Sarah suspected they were actually artwork meant to intimidate visitors. Her footsteps echoed in the vast space as she made her way toward the main concourse, following the directional markers that helpfully glowed in multiple languages. She passed several beings that she recognized from her xenobiology texts. A pair of Thraxians, their chitinous exoskeletons clicking softly as they moved on 6 legs, their compound eyes tracking her movement. A lone Vorthin, its muscular frame covered in the deep blue fur that marked it as a high-altitude predator, gave her a long look before continuing on its way. The main concourse was a marvel of engineering, a vast circular space with multiple levels connected by ramps and lifts. At its center stood a holographic display showing the locations of various research areas, entertainment districts, and what were euphemistically called dominance chambers. Sarah consulted her datapad and headed for the residential section, where temporary quarters had been assigned to visiting researchers. Human, the voice boomed across the concourse, causing several smaller beings to scatter. Sarah turned to see a massive figure approaching. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, the being was covered in scales that shifted color from deep green to black as it moved. Its head was elongated, with a powerful jaw filled with teeth designed for rending flesh. This was a Korthak, one of the apex predators of the galaxy, and the species that had built this station. Sarah fought every instinct that screamed at her to run. Instead, she smiled and gave a small bow. "Greetings. I'm Dr. Sarah Chun, xenobiologist from Earth." The Korthak stopped just within what most species would consider threatening distance. Its yellow eyes studied her with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "I am Commander Thakvor, Station Administrator. You're here for the behavioral study." "That's correct. I'm honored to be selected for this research opportunity." Sarah kept her voice steady and friendly, though she was acutely aware that several other beings had stopped to watch their interaction. Commander Thakvor's head tilted slightly. "Honored? Most species that come here speak of duty, necessity, or obligation. You use the word honor to describe being surrounded by the galaxy's most dangerous predators." "Well, when you put it like that, it sounds even better," Sarah replied with genuine enthusiasm. "I've spent my career studying predator behavior across different worlds. This station represents the most diverse collection of apex species I've ever had the opportunity to observe in one location." Something flickered in the commander's eyes. Surprise? Confusion? It was difficult to read Korthak expressions, but Sarah sensed a shift in the being's posture. "You study predators by choice. By passion, actually. On Earth, we have a saying, know your neighbors. I believe understanding how different species think and behave is the key to peaceful coexistence in the galaxy." Commander Thakvor made a sound that the translator couldn't quite render, somewhere between a growl and what might have been laughter. Peaceful coexistence. An interesting concept from a species that has no natural weapons, no enhanced senses, no evolutionary adaptations for survival beyond your homeworld. "Oh, but we do have adaptations," Sarah said, her eyes lighting up. "They're just not the kind you might expect. May I ask, Commander, what do you know about human behavior patterns?" "I know humans are prey animals that somehow convince themselves they are not," Thakvor replied. "Soft skin, blunt teeth, weak claws. By all logic, your species should have been extinct long before achieving spaceflight." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That's a common assessment. But consider this. Humans are the only species that actively seeks out dangerous predators for recreational interaction. We keep creatures in our homes that could easily injure or kill us, not for protection or utility, but for companionship. We've made documentaries celebrating the hunting prowess of beings that would consider us prey. We study, admire, and even attempt to communicate with creatures that every other species in the galaxy avoids. This proves what I said. Your species lacks proper survival instincts. Or, Sarah said with a grin, it proves that our survival instincts are more complex than most species realize. Tell me, Commander, how many truly dangerous situations have you encountered where the correct response was to fight or flee?" Thakvor considered this. "Most situations require one or the other. On Earth, we discovered a third option. Sometimes the best survival strategy is to make friends with the thing that wants to eat you." Sarah opened one of her equipment bags and pulled out a datapad showing video footage. Would you like to see what I mean? Despite himself, Commander Thakvor leaned in to look at the small screen. The video showed a human researcher, barely out of adolescence by the look of him, sitting calmly in tall grass while a massive feline predator approached. The creature was easily 3 times the human's weight, with fangs and claws designed for killing large prey. This human is about to die, Thakvor observed. Watch, Sarah said quietly. On screen, the young researcher remained perfectly still as the great cat sniffed at him. Then, slowly, the human extended his hand. The predator investigated the offered appendage, then did something that made Commander Thakvor's scales ripple in surprise. It rubbed its massive head against the human's palm, producing a sound that the video's audio pickup registered as a deep, rumbling purr. The human is grooming it, Thakvor asked, watching as the researcher's gentle touches seemed to relax the dangerous creature. Mutual grooming, actually. This is a lioness, one of Earth's apex predators. The researcher spent 3 months learning her behavioral patterns, understanding her social structure, and gradually building trust. By the end of his study, she would seek him out for these interaction sessions. But why would a predator allow this? Why would it waste energy on a non-threat when it could simply ignore the human? Sarah's smile widened. Because humans have something that most species don't. We have the ability to make even the fiercest predators curious about us, rather than simply seeing us as food or competition. She switched to another video, this one showing a human swimming alongside creatures that looked like living nightmares. They had rows of razor teeth, powerful tails, and dead black eyes that spoke of millions of years of evolutionary perfection as killers. Sharks, Sarah explained, another of Earth's apex predators. This researcher is documenting their hunting behaviors by joining their hunting group. Joining, Thakvor's voice rose an octave. The human is swimming with them. It took months of careful observation and gradual introduction, but yes, the sharks eventually accepted her as a non-threatening presence in their environment. Some even seemed to enjoy the interaction. Commander Thakvor stared at the screen, his predatory mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Every instinct told him that the humans in these videos should be dead, yet they were not only surviving, but actually forming some kind of relationship with creatures that should view them as prey. This behavior, he said slowly, it is common among your species? Common enough that we have entire academic disciplines devoted to it. Wildlife biology, animal psychology, interspecies communication theory. We've even developed something called wildlife rehabilitation, where we care for injured predators until they can return to the wild. You heal creatures that could kill you. We heal creatures that could kill us, and then we release them back into environments where they might kill other humans. Sarah laughed at Thakvor's expression. I know it sounds insane by galactic standards, but it works. We've learned more about predator behavior in the last century than most species learn in millennia of avoiding dangerous creatures. A commotion near one of the side corridors interrupted their conversation. Sarah turned to see a group of beings gathered around what appeared to be some kind of disturbance. Their body language suggested excitement rather than alarm, so she assumed it was some kind of entertainment rather than an emergency. "Excuse me, Commander, but what's happening over there?" Thakvor followed her gaze and made that untranslatable sound again. The young ones are being introduced to visitors. It is educational for both groups. Young ones, offspring of various species. They are raised communally on the station until they reach maturity. It teaches them to interact with different types of predators and prey. Thakvor paused, studying Sarah's interested expression. "You would like to observe?" "Very much, if it's permitted. For a human who swims with sharks, I believe we can make an exception." As they approached the group, Sarah could see the source of the excitement. A series of reinforced enclosures had been set up in the corridor, each containing young members of different predatory species. The offspring were small enough to be handled safely, but even at their reduced size, they exhibited all the behaviors that would make them feared apex predators as adults. A Thraxian youngling, no larger than Sarah's hand, was demonstrating its ability to cut through metal with its developing mandibles. A juvenile Vorthen, covered in fluffy fur that would become the intimidating coat of an adult, was playfully stalking a mechanical toy with surprising coordination. And in the center enclosure, drawing the most attention, was something Sarah had never seen before. "What species is that?" she asked, pointing to a creature about the size of a house cat. It had the general body plan of a mammal, but its proportions were all wrong. The head was too large, the eyes too big, the limbs too short. It looked, for lack of a better comparison, like someone had taken a terrifying adult predator and compressed it down to a more manageable size while maintaining all its dangerous features in miniature. "C'est effrayant," Takfor replied. "One of the most dangerous species in the galaxy when fully grown. Adult Zephyrians have been known to hunt Korthak for sport." Sarah watched as the small creature prowled around its enclosure, its movements displaying a predatory grace that was both beautiful and unnerving. Its fur was a deep midnight blue with silver markings, and its eyes held an intelligence that seemed far too advanced for such a young animal. "How dangerous is it at this age?" Sarah asked. "Dangerous enough. Those teeth can puncture most body armors, and its reflexes are already faster than most adult species can track. It will be returned to its home world in another few months before it becomes truly lethal." As if sensing their conversation, the Zephyrian cub turned its large eyes toward them. Sarah felt a familiar thrill, the same excitement she had experienced as a child visiting Earth zoos. Here was a creature perfectly adapted for its ecological niche, a living example of millions of years of evolutionary refinement. Without thinking, she stepped closer to the enclosure. "Dr. Chun," Commander Thakvor warned, "I would not recommend." The cub moved faster than Sarah's eyes could follow. One moment, it was on the far side of its enclosure. The next, it was pressed against the transparent barrier, its small paws extended toward her. But rather than displaying aggression, it seemed curious. Sarah knelt down to bring herself to the creature's eye level. "Hello there," she said softly. "Aren't you beautiful?" The cub tilted its head, studying her with those impossibly large eyes. It made a sound, a soft chirping noise that seemed completely at odds with its predatory appearance. "I've never seen one react that way to a visitor," Thakvor admitted. "May I?" Sarah asked, gesturing toward the enclosure. "Absolutely not. The barriers are in place for the safety of both the younglings and the observers." Sarah nodded, understanding the reasoning, but she remained kneeling by the enclosure. The cub continued to watch her, occasionally pressing its paws against the barrier as if trying to reach her. "Commander," she said quietly, "what's the standard protocol for introducing new species to the younglings?" "There is no standard protocol. Most species prefer to observe from a distance. The few that have attempted closer interaction have usually ended the session prematurely due to aggressive responses from the younglings. But this one doesn't seem aggressive. Zephyrians are ambush predators. They are never aggressive until they strike." Sarah studied the cub's body language. Its posture was relaxed, its movements fluid rather than tense. Its vocalizations continued, the soft chirping sounds interspersed with what sounded almost like purring. Every indicator she could read suggested curiosity rather than predatory intent. "Commander, I'd like to make a request." Thakvor's scales shifted to a darker shade. "I'm not going to authorize direct contact with a Zephyrian youngling, Dr. Chun. Not direct contact, but could we modify the barrier slightly? Perhaps a small opening that would allow for controlled interaction." "What kind of controlled interaction?" Sarah smiled, the expression that had convinced research committees to fund expeditions to some of the most dangerous worlds in human space. "I'd like to see if this little one is as interested in making friends as it appears to be." Commander Thakvor looked from Sarah to the cub, which was now making increasingly complex vocalizations while maintaining its focus on the human. Around them, other station residents had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual sight of a human showing interest in direct interaction with one of the most feared species in the galaxy. "Dr. Chun," Thakvor said finally, "I believe your species' reputation for insanity may be well-deserved." "Probably," Sarah agreed cheerfully. "But think of the research opportunities. The crowd around them continued to grow as word spread through the station that the human researcher was requesting permission to interact with a Zephyrian cub. Sarah remained focused on the small predator, watching its behavior patterns and trying to understand what she was seeing in its responses to her presence. This was what she lived for. The moment when two completely different species recognized something in each other that transcended the usual predator-prey dynamics. It was the same thrill she had felt swimming with sharks, walking among lions, and studying the hunting behaviors of creatures that most humans would never dream of approaching. The Zephyrian cub pressed itself against the barrier again and made a sound that Sarah could have sworn was almost like laughter. Commander Thakvor found himself in an unprecedented situation. In his 15 years as administrator of Kepler's Rest, he had never received a request for modified containment protocols from a visiting researcher. More troubling was the fact that he was actually considering it. The crowd that had gathered around the youngling enclosures now numbered nearly 50 beings from at least a dozen different species. Word of the humans' interaction with the Zephyrian cub had spread through the station's communication networks with remarkable speed. Thakvor could see representatives from the Galactic Council's research division pushing through the crowd, their recording equipment already active. "Dr. Chun," he said carefully, "you understand that if I authorize any modification to the containment protocols, you will be accepting full responsibility for the consequences?" Sarah looked up from where she was still crouched by the enclosure, her attention split between the commander and the cub that continued to vocalize at her through the barrier. "I understand the risks, Commander, but I also understand the potential benefits. This could be the first recorded instance of voluntary interspecies communication between humans and Zephyrians. Or it could be the first recorded instance of a Zephyrian youngling attacking a human researcher. That's also possible," Sarah admitted with a grin that Thakvor was beginning to recognize as distinctly human. It was an expression that seemed to appear most often when discussing potentially dangerous situations. But consider the scientific value either way. If the cub reacts aggressively, we learn something important about Zephyrian behavioral development. If it doesn't, you may have discovered something that could change how we understand predator-prey relationships across the galaxy, finished a new voice. Thakvor turned to see Dr. Kethmar approaching, his 6 legs carrying his Thraxian form through the crowd with practiced ease. As the station's chief xenobiologist, Kethmar had authority over all research activities involving the younglings. "Dr. Kethmar," Thakvor acknowledged, "I assume you've been monitoring the situation?" "Indeed. The behavioral readings from the Zephyrian cub are unlike anything in our database." Kethmar's compound eyes focused on Sarah, then shifted to observe the cub. "Dr. Chun, what is your assessment of the youngling's current state?" Sarah stood, brushing dust from her knees, and pulled out a small scanner from her equipment bag. "Based on observable behaviors, I'd say the cub is displaying classic curiosity responses rather than predatory interest. Its posture is relaxed. Vocalizations are in frequency ranges associated with social communication rather than territorial warnings, and its movement pattern suggests play behavior rather than hunting preparation." "Fascinating." Kethmar moved closer to the enclosure, his specialized sensory equipment automatically recording the cub's reactions. "The pheromone readings support your assessment. The youngling is producing chemical signatures associated with social bonding attempts." "Social bonding?" Thakvor's scales rippled with surprise. "Zephyrians are solitary hunters. They don't engage in social bonding behaviors. Adult Zephyrians don't," Sarah corrected gently. "But we're looking at a juvenile. Many species that are solitary as adults engage in social behaviors during their developmental phases. It's how they learn the skills they'll need for survival." Dr. Kethmar manipulated his scanning equipment, focusing on the cub's neurological activity. "Dr. Chun, the brain pattern readings indicate elevated activity in regions associated with learning and memory formation. The youngling appears to be studying you as intently as you're studying it." Sarah laughed, a sound that seemed to delight the cub, which responded with renewed chirping. "That makes sense. Predators are naturally curious about new things in their environment. The question is whether that curiosity will manifest as investigative behavior or aggressive testing. There's only one way to find out, Thakvor said, surprised to hear the words coming from his own mouth. The human's enthusiasm was apparently contagious. Dr. Kethmar, what modifications would you recommend to the containment protocols? The Thraxian scientist's mandibles clicked in what Sarah was learning to recognize as excitement. A small access port, perhaps 10 centimeters in diameter, positioned at approximately half the height of the enclosure. Large enough for limited physical contact, but small enough to prevent the youngling from attempting to exit the containment area. And safeguards? Takfwa asked. Emergency containment fields can be activated instantly if the youngling shows any signs of aggressive behavior. Additionally, we can flood the enclosure with a mild sedative gas if necessary. Sarah held up a hand. I appreciate the safety measures, but I'd prefer to avoid any interventions that might alter the cub's natural behavior. If we're going to learn something meaningful from this interaction, it needs to be authentic. Dr. Chun, Thakvor said slowly, you're asking us to allow you to make physical contact with a Zephyrian youngling with no safety measures beyond a small barrier opening. I'm asking you to trust that I know what I'm doing. I've spent years studying predator behavior patterns, and I've successfully established communication with dozens of species that were initially considered too dangerous for human interaction. Around them, the crowd had grown quiet, listening to the exchange between the researchers and the station administrator. Sarah could see beings from species she didn't recognize, all watching with a fascination that seemed to be universal when someone was about to do something either very brave or very stupid. The cub is responding to your voice, Dr. Kethmar observed. Each time you speak, its vocalizations increase in complexity and frequency. Sarah turned back to the enclosure and spoke directly to the small predator. What do you think, little one? Would you like to meet a human? The cub's response was immediate and dramatic. It approached the barrier and began what could only be described as a performance. It rolled, jumped, spun in circles, and produced a variety of sounds ranging from chirps to what sounded almost like laughter. The display was so clearly communicative that several beings in the crowd made sounds of surprise. I've never seen behavior like that from any of the younglings, Dr. Kethmar admitted. It's almost as if it's trying to entertain her, Thakvor finished. Or impress her. Sarah felt a familiar warmth in her chest, the same feeling she experienced whenever she achieved a breakthrough in interspecies communication. Commander, with your permission, I'd like to try something. Without waiting for a response, Sarah began to move. She crouched down, then rolled sideways, mimicking some of the cub's movements. The effect on the small Zephyrian was electric. It stopped its own movements and watched intently as Sarah performed her clumsy imitation of its display. When she finished, the cub sat back on its haunches and made a sound that was unmistakably approval. Then it began its performance again, but this time more slowly, as if demonstrating the proper technique. It's teaching her, someone in the crowd whispered. Sarah tried again, this time following the cub's slower demonstration more accurately. The small predator's excitement was palpable, its chirping reaching frequencies that made several species in the crowd cover their auditory organs. Dr. Chun, Thakvor said, his voice carrying a tone of wonder that surprised him, I believe you have established communication with a Zephyrian youngling. Basic communication, Sarah corrected, but her smile was radiant. We're sharing movement patterns and vocalizations, but we're definitely communicating. Dr. Kethmar was recording everything, his equipment capturing not just visual and audio data, but also chemical signatures, electromagnetic fields, and biometric readings from both the human and the cub. The scientific implications of this are staggering. If we can document successful communication protocols between humans and Zephyrians at the juvenile stage, we might be able to develop better understanding of the species as a whole, Sarah finished, which could lead to more effective conservation efforts, better protection protocols, and possibly even eventual diplomatic contact with adult populations. Assuming you survive the next few minutes, Thakvor muttered, but he was already activating his administrative override codes. Dr. Kethmar, prepare the containment modification. Dr. Chun, I want you to understand that if this goes wrong, there may not be enough left of you to identify. Understood and accepted, Sarah replied cheerfully, though I should point out that the cub seems more interested in playing than hunting. As the station's automated systems began modifying the enclosure, adding a small access port at the designated height, the cub continued its interaction with Sarah. It had begun imitating some of her movements, its predatory grace, making even simple gestures look elegant and dangerous. The modification took only a few minutes, but each second seemed to stretch as the crowd watched in anticipation. When the work was complete, a small circular opening appeared in the barrier, protected by a force field that could be deactivated from the outside. Dr. Chun, Fakvor said formally, "You may proceed." Sarah approached the new opening slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. The cub watched her approach, its large eyes tracking every step. When she was within arm's reach of the opening, she stopped and extended her hand toward the force field. "Hello," she said softly. "I'm Sara." The cub approached the opening from its side, sniffing at the air around the force field. Sarah could see its nostrils flaring as it processed her scent, filing away information about this new type of being. "Dr. Kethmar," Fakvor said quietly, "are you recording everything? Every sensor we have is active. This interaction will be studied for decades." Sarah looked back at the two researchers, then at the crowd of beings watching her every move. "Commander, would you deactivate the force field, please?" The moment stretched, pregnant with possibility and danger. Then, Fakvor made a decision that he would question for years afterward. Force field deactivated. The barrier between human and Zephyrian cub disappeared. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the cub, moving with the fluid grace of a born predator, extended one small paw through the opening. Sarah, moving with equal care, extended her index finger to meet it. The contact was gentle, almost tentative. The cub's paw pad was soft and warm, with small claws that could easily puncture human skin but remained carefully sheathed. Sarah could feel the small creature's pulse through its paw, rapid but steady. "Contact established," Dr. Kethmar reported unnecessarily. Every being in the corridor could see the moment of connection between two species that should have been natural enemies. The cub made a soft sound, almost a sigh, and pressed its palm more firmly against Sarah's finger. Then, moving with deliberate care, it began to explore her hand with the tip of its small muzzle. "It's investigating my scent," Sarah explained quietly, trying not to disturb the moment. "Learning to identify me as an individual rather than just a member of a species." The exploration continued for several minutes, with the cub carefully examining Sarah's hand, wrist, and lower arm. Its movements were gentle and curious, showing none of the aggressive testing that might be expected from a predator encountering unfamiliar prey. Then, something unexpected happened. The cub made a playful lunge at Sarah's jacket sleeve, its small teeth catching in the tough fabric. But instead of releasing and retreating, it held on, its weight too light to cause any real pull, but enough to be noticeable. Sarah looked down at the small creature hanging from her sleeve and did something that no one expected. She laughed. Not a nervous laugh or a laugh of relief, but genuine, delighted laughter at the absurdity and charm of the situation. The sound echoed through the corridor, causing several species to step back in surprise. The cub, startled by the sound, released its grip on the fabric and retreated slightly into its enclosure. But its large eyes remained fixed on Sarah, and after a moment, it made a sound that could only be described as an attempt to mimic her laughter. "Did it just—" Dr. Kethmar began. "Yes," Sarah said, her eyes bright with excitement. "It's trying to reproduce the sound I made. It's attempting vocal mimicry." She laughed again, a shorter, softer sound this time. The cub responded immediately with its own approximation, the sound rough and not quite right, but unmistakably an attempt at communication. Around them, the crowd was absolutely silent. The sight of a human laughing while a Zephyrian cub attempted to laugh back was so far outside the realm of expected behavior that most species present had no framework for processing what they were witnessing. "Commander," Sarah said without taking her eyes off the cub, "I'd like to request extended observation time with this individual." "How extended?" Thakvor asked, though his tone suggested he already knew he was going to approve whatever she requested. "As long as it takes to establish a comprehensive communication protocol. This could be the breakthrough we need to understand predator cognition at a fundamental level." The cub, apparently deciding that Sarah was no longer a threat, approached the opening again. This time, instead of just extending a paw, it pushed its entire head through the gap, its large eyes studying the humans and aliens gathered in the corridor. Sarah remained perfectly still as the small predator examined their audience. She could sense the cub's assessment of each being, its predatory instincts cataloging threats, opportunities, and curiosities. When the cub's gaze returned to her, Sarah smiled and spoke quietly. "What do you think of all this attention, little one?" The cub's response was to withdraw back into its enclosure, then return with something in its mouth. It was a small toy, one of the enrichment items provided to keep the younglings mentally stimulated during their stay on the station. Carefully, deliberately, the cub pushed the toy through the opening and dropped it at Sarah's feet. The gesture was unmistakable. It was an offering, a gift from predator to friend. Sarah picked up the small toy, examined it carefully, then looked back at the cub. "Thank you," she said seriously. "This is beautiful." The cub's response was a soft, chittering sound that conveyed satisfaction and pleasure. Dr. Kethmar's equipment was recording everything, but even the sophisticated sensors couldn't capture the full significance of what was happening. For the first time in galactic history, a member of one of the most feared predator species was engaging in gift-giving behavior with a human. As the crowd began to disperse, word of the interaction spreading throughout the station, Sarah settled in for a long observation session. She had work to do, behaviors to document, and a communication protocol to develop. The Zephyrian cub, apparently equally committed to the interaction, curled up near the opening and began what could only be described as a purr. 3 days had passed since Sarah's first contact with the Zephyrian cub, and Kepler's Rest had transformed from a routine research station into the center of galactic attention. Representatives from dozens of species had arrived to witness what the media was calling the impossible friendship, and Sarah found herself dealing with more requests for interviews than she could handle while maintaining her research schedule. The cub, which Sarah had begun calling Pip after its tendency to make small chirping sounds, had shown remarkable progress in their communication sessions. What had started as simple physical contact and vocal mimicry had evolved into something approaching a rudimentary language based on gestures, sounds, and even shared play behaviors. "Dr. Chun," Commander Thakvor said as he approached her workstation in the corridor outside Pip's enclosure, "the Galactic Council has requested a formal presentation of your findings." Sarah looked up from her data analysis, pushing a strand of dark hair out of her eyes. She had been working almost nonstop, documenting every interaction with Pip and comparing the behavioral patterns to her database of Earth-predator relationships. "When? Tomorrow. Representatives from 47 different species are traveling here specifically to observe your work." Thakvor's scales shifted to show his concern. "The pressure from a scientific community is considerable. And the pressure from the political community?" Sarah asked, recognizing the careful tone in his voice. "Several species have expressed concern about the implications of human-Zephyrian communication. If your research proves that peaceful contact is possible with one of the galaxy's most feared predators, it might challenge some fundamental assumptions about interspecies relationships," Sarah finished. "I understand the concern, Commander, but science doesn't care about political convenience." Through the transparent barrier, Pip had been watching their conversation with the intense focus that Sarah had learned meant he was trying to understand the dynamics between the two larger beings. Over the past 3 days, the cub had become remarkably good at reading human and Korthak body language, often responding to emotional states before they were verbally expressed. "Pip senses your stress," Sarah observed, watching as the cub approached the opening and made soft, questioning sounds. He's been learning to recognize emotional states in different species. It can read emotions? Thakvor asked, his predatory instincts immediately alert to any new information about Zephyrian capabilities. To some degree, yes. Watch. Sarah deliberately relaxed her posture and smiled at Pip. The cub's response was immediate, his own posture becoming more playful as he began performing one of the acrobatic displays that had become their way of greeting each other. Now watch what happens when I simulate distress. Sarah allowed her expression to become worried, hunching her shoulders slightly and avoiding direct eye contact with Pip. The cub's reaction was striking. His playful behavior stopped immediately, replaced by what could only be described as concern. He approached the opening and made soft, soothing sounds while extending his paw towards Sarah's position. Remarkable, Thakvor murmured. It's attempting to comfort you. Not just comfort, Sarah said, allowing herself to smile again, and watching Pip's immediate return to relaxed behavior. He's actively trying to improve my emotional state. That suggests a level of empathy that wasn't documented in any previous studies of Zephyrian behavior. Dr. Kethmar arrived as they were speaking, his 6 legs carrying him quickly through the corridor. His compound eyes were bright with excitement, and his mandibles were clicking rapidly. Dr. Chun, you need to see the comparative analysis from the other younglings. Sarah accepted the data pad he offered, scanning the information quickly. Over the past 3 days, the research team had been monitoring all the younglings in the communal area to see if Pip's behavioral changes were unique or part of a broader pattern. This is fascinating, she said after reviewing the data. The other cubs have been exhibiting increased social behaviors since my interactions with Pip began. More than that, Kethmar explained. They've been attempting to interact with other station personnel. The Thraxian youngling tried to engage one of the maintenance workers in what appeared to be a grooming behavior. The young Vorthan has been bringing toys to its enclosure boundary whenever researchers approach. Sarah looked at the data more carefully, her excitement growing as she recognized the pattern. They're learning from Pip's example. Social behavior is spreading through the group. But how? Thakvor asked. The enclosures are separate. The younglings can see and hear each other, but they can't engage in direct contact. Visual learning, Sarah replied, pulling up video feeds from the other enclosures. Predator species are naturally observant. They learn by watching other members of their environment and adapting successful behaviors. Pip's positive interactions with me have demonstrated that humans can be beneficial rather than threatening. So the other cubs are testing that hypothesis with their own human contacts. She pointed to a section of video showing the Thraxian youngling. Look at this behavior pattern. It's almost identical to what Pip was doing on our first day together. The investigative approach, the careful testing of boundaries, the gradual increase in interaction intensity, which suggests, Kethmar said, his excitement obvious, that your communication protocol with Pip could be adapted for use with multiple predator species. That's exactly what it suggests. Sarah looked back at Pip, who had been following their conversation with the patient attention of a student listening to teachers discuss his progress. The question is whether we can scale this up without losing the individual relationship that makes it work. Commander Thakvor considered this, his strategic mind immediately grasping the implications. Dr. Chun, if your research proves that humans can establish peaceful communication with multiple predator species, it could revolutionize galactic diplomacy. Or it could terrify half the galaxy, Sarah replied with her characteristic honesty. Not every species is going to be comfortable with the idea that humans can make friends with their nightmares. As if summoned by their discussion, a new voice interrupted the conversation. Dr. Chun, I presume? They turned to see an imposing figure approaching through the corridor. The being was tall and slender with the pale, translucent skin that marked it as a member of the ethereal collective. Its large, dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed to look directly into Sarah's soul, and its movement was so smooth it seemed to glide rather than walk. I am Ambassador Veltar of the Ethereal Collective. The being continued, its voice carrying harmonics that suggested multiple vocal cords. I have come to observe your work and assess its implications for galactic stability. Sarah stood, recognizing the formal nature of the introduction. The Ethereal Collective was one of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy, and their opinion carried significant weight in the Galactic Council. Ambassador, I'm honored by your interest in our research. Your research has created considerable discussion among the member species, Veltar replied. Many are concerned about the potential consequences of teaching predator species to view humans as allies rather than prey. With respect, Ambassador, I'm not teaching them anything. I'm learning from them. The capacity for interspecies cooperation was already present in their behavioral repertoire. I'm simply providing the opportunity for it to be expressed. Veltar moved closer to Pip's enclosure, studying the cub with the same intensity that Pip used when observing new beings. This creature is a Zephyrian youngling. In approximately 18 months, it will be capable of hunting adult Korthak for sport. You see no danger in establishing emotional bonds with such a being? Pip, apparently sensing the tension in the conversation, had moved to the back of his enclosure and was watching the new arrival with obvious wariness. His body language showed none of the relaxed curiosity he displayed with familiar humans. I see opportunity, Sarah replied. If we can establish communication protocols with Zephyrians during their juvenile phase, we might be able to prevent the territorial conflicts that currently make them one of the most dangerous species for space travelers to encounter. Or, Veltar said quietly, you might be teaching them to recognize human ships and seek them out specifically. The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. In her excitement about the research breakthrough, she hadn't fully considered the possibility that Pip might carry his positive associations with humans into adulthood, potentially leading other Zephyrians to view human vessels as sources of interesting interaction rather than prey to be avoided. That's a risk, she admitted, but it's also an opportunity. If adult Zephyrians sought out human contact for positive interaction rather than conflict, it could lead to unprecedented cooperation between our species. Or unprecedented disaster if the interactions don't go as planned, Commander Thakvor added, his strategic mind immediately grasping both the potential benefits and dangers. Ambassador Veltar continued studying Pip, who remained pressed against the back of his enclosure. The youngling's reaction to my presence is instructive. It recognizes threat even when no overtly threatening behavior is displayed. This suggests sophisticated social intelligence. More sophisticated than we initially realized, Sarah agreed. Pip has been learning to read the emotional states and social dynamics of every species he encounters. His behavioral responses are becoming more nuanced each day. As if to demonstrate her point, Pip suddenly moved forward in his enclosure, approaching the opening where Sarah stood. But instead of his usual playful greeting, he positioned himself between Sarah and Ambassador Veltar, his small body tense and alert. He's protecting you, Thakvor observed with surprise. Or trying to, Sarah said, touched by the gesture. Pip, it's okay. Ambassador Veltar isn't a threat. But Pip remained vigilant, his large eyes fixed on the ethereal diplomat. His posture suggested he was prepared to defend Sarah despite the obvious size difference between himself and the adult being surrounding his enclosure. Ambassador Veltar made a sound that might have been approval. Loyalty to individuals over species. This is not typical predator behavior. It's not typical of any behavior we've documented. Dr. Kethmar interjected. The youngling has developed what can only be described as personal attachment to Dr. Chun. Personal attachment, Veltar repeated thoughtfully. This raises additional questions about the long-term implications of your research. If Zephyrians can form personal attachments to humans, what happens when those humans are no longer available? Sarah felt a chill as she considered the question. In her focus on documenting the immediate behavioral changes, she hadn't fully thought through the long-term consequences for Pip himself. In a few months, he would be returned to his homeworld, separated from a human who had become his primary social contact. That's something we'll need to address in the research protocols, she said carefully. We need to ensure that any social bonds formed during the study don't create psychological trauma when the subjects are returned to their natural environments. Indeed, Veltar agreed. The ethereal collective has seen the consequences of poorly managed interspecies contact. The emotional cost can be as significant as any physical danger. Pip, perhaps sensing the shift in the conversation's tone, made a soft sound that drew everyone's attention back to him. He had retrieved one of his toys and was holding it out through the opening, offering it to Ambassador Veltar. The gesture was so clearly an attempt at reconciliation that even the normally composed, ethereal diplomat seemed surprised. "He's trying to make friends with you," Sarah explained. "It's the same behavior he showed me on our first meeting." Veltar considered the offered toy, then looked at Sarah. "May I?" "Of course. Just move slowly and let him set the pace of interaction." The ambassador reached out with one long, pale finger and gently touched the toy. Pip's response was immediate and positive, his wariness replaced by curious interest in this new type of being. Within minutes, Ambassador Veltar was experiencing the same progression of interactions that Sarah had documented with other species. Pip's natural curiosity overcame his initial caution, leading to the beginning of another interspecies friendship. "Remarkable," Veltar murmured as Pip began performing a simplified version of his acrobatic display. "The transition from wariness to acceptance is extremely rapid. That's been consistent across all his interactions," Sarah noted. "Pip seems to have an innate ability to assess whether a being represents a genuine threat or just an unfamiliar presence." As the day progressed, Sarah found herself documenting yet another successful first contact between Pip and a new species. The Zephyrian cub's ability to adapt his communication style to different beings was becoming one of the most significant findings of the study. But as she watched Pip charming Ambassador Veltar with the same techniques that had won over the station's entire research staff, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were approaching something much larger than a simple behavioral study. They were documenting the birth of a new form of galactic diplomacy, one based on curiosity and play rather than fear and dominance. The question was whether the galaxy was ready for such a fundamental shift in how species related to each other. Looking at Pip's joyful interaction with beings who should have been natural enemies, Sarah decided that, ready or not, change was coming. The main assembly hall of Kepler's Rest had never hosted an event quite like this. Representatives from 47 different species filled the massive chamber, their varied forms creating a tapestry of galactic diversity that would have been impossible to imagine just a week earlier. The air recycling systems worked overtime to accommodate the different atmospheric requirements, while translation protocols struggled to handle the complex mix of languages, pheromone communications, and electromagnetic signals that constituted the galaxy's diplomatic discourse. Sarah stood at the center of the hall, feeling remarkably small despite the portable enclosure that had been constructed for Pip's demonstration. The young Zephyrian was currently exploring his temporary home with typical curiosity, apparently unbothered by the hundreds of eyes, sensors, and recording devices focused on him. "Ladies, gentlemen, and esteemed beings," Commander Thakvor announced, his voice amplified throughout the hall. "We gather today to witness a presentation that may fundamentally alter our understanding of predator-prey relationships across the galaxy." The murmur of conversation that had filled the hall gradually died away as representatives focused their attention on the central platform. Sarah could see delegates from species she had only read about in xenobiology texts. There were crystalline beings from the Silicon Reaches, whose thoughts moved at speeds that required special translation equipment. Gaseous entities from the nebula collectives had been provided with containment suits that allowed them to maintain coherent form in the station's solid matter environment. Even the mysterious deep dwellers had sent a representative, though it remained in a specialized pressure vessel that gave no hint of its actual appearance. Dr. Sarah Chun of Earth, Thakvor continued, will present her findings regarding successful communication protocols established with a juvenile Zephyrian subject. Sarah stepped forward, feeling the weight of galactic attention settling on her shoulders. She had given presentations before, but never with stakes quite this high. The future of human-alien relations might well depend on how the next hour went. Honored delegates, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's acoustics. 1 week ago, most of you would have considered what you're about to see impossible. The conventional wisdom holds that predator species like the Zephyrians are too dangerous, too aggressive, and too territorial for meaningful, peaceful contact. She gestured toward Pip's enclosure, where the cub had found a perch that gave him a good view of the assembled delegates. I'm here to demonstrate that conventional wisdom may be incomplete. A delegate from the cautious assembly, a species known for their extreme risk aversion, raised appendage. Dr. Chun, are you suggesting that Zephyrians are not dangerous? Because our species has documented evidence of 17 separate incidents where adult Zephyrians destroyed entire survey vessels. I'm not suggesting they're not dangerous, Delegate Frexton. I'm suggesting that dangerous doesn't necessarily mean hostile. On Earth, we have many species that are capable of killing humans, but choose not to when presented with alternatives. Sarah activated her presentation system, displaying video footage from her Earth archives. This is a grizzly bear, one of Earth's apex predators. An adult specimen can weigh over 800 pounds and has claws capable of tearing through metal. Under normal circumstances, a human encountering one in the wild would face significant danger. The video showed a massive bear moving through a forest, its power evident in every step. However, Sarah continued, switching to different footage. When approached with proper understanding of the species' behavioral patterns, even these dangerous predators can engage in peaceful interaction. The new video showed a human researcher sitting calmly as an enormous bear investigated him, eventually settling down beside the human in what appeared to be companionable silence. The key, Sarah explained, is understanding what the predator wants and needs from the interaction. Most aggressive behavior stems from fear, territorial protection, or resource competition. Remove those factors, and you often find that predators are naturally curious about other intelligent beings. Ambassador Veltar, who had been observing from the front row, spoke up. Dr. Chun, your Earth examples are compelling, but they involve members of the same planetary ecosystem. The Zephyrian is an alien species with different evolutionary pressures and social structures. You're absolutely right, Ambassador, which is why what you're about to see is so significant. Sarah turned toward Pip's enclosure, where the cub had been following the conversation with obvious interest. Pip, would you like to meet everyone? The Zephyrian cub's response was immediate and enthusiastic. He moved to the front of his enclosure and began one of his elaborate greeting displays, spinning, jumping, and vocalizing in patterns that Sarah had learned were his way of expressing excitement about meeting new beings. A ripple of surprise ran through the assembly. Many of the delegates had expected to see a miniature monster, all teeth and claws and predatory aggression. Instead, they were watching what appeared to be an enthusiastic performance designed to entertain and engage. This is not typical Zephyrian behavior, noted Dr. Zefkan, the galaxy's leading expert on predator species psychology. Zephyrians are ambush hunters. They should not engage in display behaviors that would reveal their location to potential prey. That's correct, Sarah agreed. Pip's behavior represents a significant departure from documented Zephyrian norms. But it's not a random mutation or aberration. It's a learned response based on positive reinforcement from successful social interactions. She opened the enclosure's access port, the same modification that had been used for their initial contact. Pip immediately moved to the opening, extending his paw towards Sarah in their established greeting ritual. What you're seeing, Sarah explained as she gently touched the cub's paw, is the foundation of interspecies communication. Pip has learned that humans respond positively to certain behaviors, so he's developed and refined those behaviors to facilitate better interaction. But what does he gain from this interaction? Asked a delegate from the Logical Consortium, a species that viewed all behavior through the lens of cost-benefit analysis. Predators don't typically expend energy on non-productive activities. Sarah smiled, recognizing the question she'd been hoping someone would ask. That's the key insight from this research. Pip gains social stimulation, learning opportunities, and what we might call companionship. These benefits are significant enough to motivate him to modify his instinctive behaviors. To demonstrate, Sarah reached into her equipment bag and pulled out a new toy, something Pip had never seen before. It was a complex puzzle designed to challenge problem-solving abilities, with multiple moving parts and hidden rewards. "Pip," she said, offering the toy through the opening, "here's something new for you." The cub's reaction was immediate fascination. He took the toy carefully and began examining it, his small claws manipulating the various components with remarkable dexterity. Within minutes, he had discovered the toy's secrets and successfully accessed the treat hidden inside. But instead of consuming the treat immediately, Pip did something that caused murmurs of astonishment throughout the assembly. He broke the treat in half and offered one piece back to Sarah through the opening. Sharing behavior. Dr. Kethmar announced from his position at the monitoring station. The subject is demonstrating resource sharing with a non-family member of a different species. The impact of this simple gesture rippled through the assembled delegates. Resource sharing was considered one of the highest forms of social trust, indicating that the sharer viewed the recipient as valuable enough to justify reducing their own resources. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Zefkan admitted, his multiple eyes focused intently on Pip. Predator species guard their resources jealously, especially food resources. The metabolic cost of sharing is typically too high to justify except in very specific circumstances. "Unless," Sarah said, accepting the offered treat and making sure Pip saw her eat it with appreciation, "the social bond is valuable enough to offset the metabolic cost." Pip has learned that maintaining positive relationships with humans leads to more opportunities for stimulation, learning, and social interaction. She turned to address the assembly directly. "What we're documenting here isn't just unusual behavior from a single individual. It's evidence that predator species are capable of complex social calculations that include non-material benefits." A new voice spoke from the back of the assembly, its tone carrying authority that made other delegates turn to listen. "Dr. Chun, I am High Arbiter Klexmore of the Dominance Hierarchy. Your demonstration is impressive, but it raises a troubling question." Sarah recognized the name. The Dominance Hierarchy was one of the most militaristic species in the galaxy, their entire society built around the principle that strength determined rights. Their opinion would carry significant weight with other warrior cultures. "What question is that, High Arbiter? If predator species can be taught to form social bonds with prey species, what prevents them from using those bonds as hunting strategies? A Zephyrian that has learned to mimic friendship behaviors could potentially lure unsuspecting victims into range." The question sent a chill through the assembly. Several delegates began murmuring among themselves, and Sarah could see the concern spreading through the crowd. "That's a valid concern," Sarah acknowledged, "and one that requires careful consideration. However, I'd like to point out that Pip's behaviors aren't mimicry. They're genuine responses based on emotional engagement." She gestured toward the monitoring station where Dr. Kethmar was displaying real-time biometric data. The neurological scans show authentic emotional states corresponding to pleasure, curiosity, and affection. These aren't calculated deceptions designed to achieve hunting objectives. High Arbiter Klexmore moved closer to the central platform, his massive frame causing smaller delegates to step aside. Standing nearly 9 feet tall, with armored skin and multiple weapon appendages, he represented everything that made the Dominance Hierarchy feared throughout the galaxy. "Emotion can be simulated," he stated flatly. "Hunters learn to manipulate prey psychology." "They do," Sarah agreed. "But simulation requires understanding of the target's behavioral patterns. Pip would have had to study human psychology extensively to fake the responses we've documented. Given that he had never encountered humans before our initial contact, that level of manipulation would be impossible." She paused, then decided to take a risk. "High Arbiter, would you be willing to participate in a demonstration?" The question clearly surprised the massive warrior. What kind of demonstration? "A direct interaction with Pip." If his responses are calculated deceptions designed to facilitate hunting, they should be consistent regardless of the species he encounters. If they're genuine social behaviors, they should adapt to your specific characteristics and behavioral patterns. The assembly fell silent. The idea of a high arbiter of the dominance hierarchy interacting with a predator youngling was so far outside normal protocols that most delegates weren't sure how to respond. Klexmore studied Sarah for a long moment, his multiple eyes assessing threat levels and tactical implications. Finally, he spoke. "You believe this creature will attempt to establish social contact with me? I believe he'll try to understand what kind of being you are and how to interact with you appropriately. Whether that leads to social contact will depend on how you respond to his initial approaches. And if I respond with hostility?" Sarah's expression became serious. "Then he'll almost certainly retreat and classify you as a threat to be avoided. Predators are excellent at threat assessment. Pip won't waste energy trying to befriend someone who clearly wants to harm him." High Arbiter Klexmore considered this, his tactical mind working through the implications. Finally, he stepped closer to the enclosure. Pip's reaction was immediate and dramatic. The small predator pressed himself against the back of his enclosure, his body language screaming danger assessment. Every muscle was tensed, ready to flee or fight despite the obvious size difference. He recognizes threat. Klexmore observed with what might have been approval. "He recognizes a warrior," Sarah corrected. "Your posture, movement patterns, and even your scent probably trigger every predator instinct he has. The question is whether he'll overcome those instincts if you give him reason to believe you're not a threat." Klexmore considered this, then did something that surprised everyone in the assembly. He sat down. The simple act of reducing his apparent size and changing his posture from aggressive to neutral had an immediate effect on Pip. The cub's tension decreased noticeably, though he remained alert and ready to react. "Interesting," Klexmore murmured. "It responds to postural cues. Most predators do. Body language is a primary form of communication for species that rely on physical prowess." Sarah watched as Pip began to move cautiously toward the front of his enclosure. "Try extending your hand, but move slowly and keep your palm open." The High Arbiter followed her suggestion, extending one massive hand toward the enclosure opening. His movements were deliberate and controlled, showing none of the aggressive precision that normally characterized his species' interactions. Pip studied the offered hand for several minutes, his large eyes taking in every detail. Then, moving with the careful grace of his species, he approached the opening and extended his own small paw. The moment of contact between the galaxy's most feared predator species and one of its most militaristic civilizations was captured by dozens of recording devices. When Pip's soft paw pad touched Klexmore's armored palm, something fundamental shifted in the assembly's understanding of what was possible. "He's not afraid," Klexmore said with wonder in his voice. "He assessed the threat, determined I meant no harm, and chose to make contact." "That's exactly what he did," Sarah confirmed. "Pip has learned that initial threat assessment doesn't have to determine the entire interaction. He's become willing to revise his evaluation of other beings based on their behavior rather than their appearance." As if to prove her point, Pip began one of his greeting displays, though this version was more subdued than his usual performance. The cub seemed to understand that this new being required a different approach than the humans and other species he had previously encountered. High Arbiter Klexmore watched the display with growing amazement. "This is not possible. Zephyrians do not modify their behavior based on social feedback." "Adult Zephyrians in the wild don't," Sarah agreed. "But Pip has been living in a social environment that rewards behavioral flexibility. He's learned that adapting his approach to different species leads to more successful interactions." The demonstration continued for another hour, with various delegates taking turns interacting with Pip under Sarah's guidance. The young Zephyrian proved remarkably adaptable, developing unique interaction styles for each species he encountered. By the end of the session, even the most skeptical delegates had to acknowledge that they had witnessed something unprecedented. A predator species had demonstrated the capacity for complex social learning and genuine interspecies bonding. As the assembly began to disperse, Ambassador Veltar approached Sarah at the central platform. Dr. Chun, your demonstration has been illuminating, but it has also raised questions that will require careful consideration by the Galactic Council. What questions, Ambassador? If predator species can learn complex social behaviors, what are the implications for galactic security? What happens when Pip returns to his homeworld? And, most importantly, what are humanity's intentions regarding the weaponization of this research? Sarah felt the weight of those questions settling on her shoulders. In her excitement about the scientific breakthrough, she hadn't fully considered how the galaxy's political structures might view humanity's new ability to communicate with apex predators. Looking at Pip, who was contentedly playing with a toy while dozens of species debated the implications of his existence, Sarah realized that their research had opened doorways that could never be closed again. The question now was whether those doorways led to a new era of galactic cooperation or to conflicts that could tear apart the fragile peace that currently existed between the stars. The emergency session of the Galactic Council had been in session for 6 hours, and tensions in the assembly hall were reaching dangerous levels. Sarah sat in the witness section, watching as representatives from dozens of species debated the future of her research and, by extension, the future of human-alien relations throughout the galaxy. Pip's transport back to his homeworld had been scheduled for the following day, but the Council's emergency session had put everything on hold. The young Zephyrian was currently in a specialized holding area, unaware that his future was being decided by beings who had never met him. The potential for abuse is too significant to ignore, declared Representative Mordak of the Cautious Assembly, his multiple eye stalks swaying with agitation. If humans can train predator species to view them as allies, what prevents them from building an army of loyal apex predators? The same thing that prevents any species from building armies of loyal soldiers, replied Ambassador Chun, the human representative to the Galactic Council and Sarah's distant cousin. Ethics, practicality, and the simple fact that true loyalty cannot be manufactured through manipulation. High Arbiter Klexmore rose from his position in the warrior species section. His interaction with Pip had clearly affected him, but his duty to his people's security concerns remain paramount. The dominance hierarchy acknowledges that the human researcher's work appears to be genuine scientific inquiry. However, the implications extend far beyond academic interest. He activated a holographic display showing tactical assessments that made Sarah's stomach clench. Consider the strategic advantage of a species that can approach any predator in the galaxy without fear. Consider the intelligence-gathering opportunities. Consider the potential for sabotage and infiltration using trained predator allies. Those same advantages would apply to any species that learned these techniques, pointed out Dr. Velmira of the Scientific Collective, her crystalline form chiming softly as she spoke. Dr. Chen's research has been fully documented and shared with the galactic community. These communication protocols are not a human monopoly, but humans developed them first, Klexmore countered, and humans have demonstrated an alarming tendency to form emotional attachments to dangerous creatures. This combination could prove destabilizing to galactic peace. From her position in the witness section, Sarah watched the debate with growing frustration. The Council was discussing her research as if it were a weapon rather than a breakthrough in interspecies understanding. More troubling, they were talking about Pip as if he were an object rather than a sentient being with his own preferences and relationships. Ambassador Veltar of the Ethereal Collective had remained silent throughout most of the debate, but now he rose to speak. His pale form seemed to glow softly in the chamber's lighting, and his words carried the weight of his species' ancient wisdom. "Honored colleagues," he began, his harmonious voice cutting through the argumentative chatter, "we are debating the wrong questions. We discuss whether humans should be allowed to continue this research, whether the young Zephyrian should be isolated, whether these communication protocols represent a threat or an opportunity." He paused, allowing his words to resonate through the chamber. But we are ignoring the most fundamental question. What does the Zephyrian want? A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembly. In all their debates about security implications and research protocols, none of the representatives had considered the Cub's own preferences. Ambassador Veltar raises an interesting point, said Counselor Prime Thexandra, the Galactic Council's presiding officer. But the subject is a juvenile of a non-communicating species. How can we determine its preferences? Perhaps, Veltar replied, we should ask Dr. Chon to demonstrate. All eyes turned to Sarah, who felt suddenly exposed under the weight of galactic attention. Honored Counselor, I'm not sure I understand what you're asking. You claim to have established communication protocols with the Zephyrian youngling. Can you ask it directly what it wants regarding its future? Sarah's mind raced. She had developed a complex system of gestures, sounds, and behavioral cues with Pip, but they had never attempted anything as sophisticated as discussing abstract concepts like the future or choice. I can try, she said carefully, but I should point out that our communication system is still relatively basic. Pip understands immediate concepts and simple preferences, but complex abstractions may be beyond our current protocols. Nevertheless, Counselor Prime Thexandra declared, the attempt should be made. The Council will recess while you conduct this communication session. 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself back in the corridor outside Pip's temporary enclosure, surrounded by representatives from the Galactic Council and enough recording equipment to document a diplomatic treaty signing. The young Zephyrian greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, apparently delighted to see her after their longest separation since first contact. Hello, Pip, she said softly, kneeling by the enclosure opening. I need to ask you about something important. Pip's immediate response was to offer her a toy, his standard gesture of friendship and welcome. Sarah accepted it gratefully, then tried to figure out how to explain complex political concepts to a juvenile predator. Pip, she began, tomorrow you're supposed to go back to your home, back to where you came from with others like you. She had developed a gesture system for basic concepts, and she tried to convey the idea of home and others of your kind through movements and vocalizations that Pip had learned to associate with different ideas. Pip's response was immediate and concerning. His playful demeanor disappeared, replaced by obvious distress. He pressed himself against the back of his enclosure and made soft, distressed sounds that Sarah had learned meant fear or unhappiness. He doesn't want to leave, Dr. Kethmar observed from his monitoring station. His stress indicators are spiking dramatically. Sarah tried a